Criminal prosecution. Criminal liability as it relates to medical mistakes is a very hot topic right now. Criminal liability for healthcare professionals and the care that they provide and the mistakes that they may make providing that care, or the behavior that they engage in providing that care, is not a new concept. I'll repeat that. Criminal liability is not a new concept as it relates to healthcare professionals and the care that they provide. Many of you already know that. However, it's been in the news a lot in terms of should healthcare professionals be subject to criminal liability when they make a medical mistake? Should they or should they not? There's two schools of thought on that. Some people say absolutely when it's really an egregious mistake. Some people say under no circumstances should they be subject to criminal liability. All nurses and healthcare professionals do not feel the same way about that. What you should know in your practice is, yes, it is a reality that you can be faced with criminal liability based on the care that you give for mistakes, for behavior that you engage in. You can be subject to criminal liability. It is a reality today, and it has always been a reality. And I just want you to be aware of that. Here are some allegations that are common in criminal liability: elder abuse, neglect, falsifying documentation, fraud, scope of practice issues, where someone is impostoring being a doctor when they're really a nurse, or some nurse is starting a business where they're providing care to patients that really are outside their scope of practice, committing a fatal error, giving a medication that causes a death, neglecting to provide care in a way that causes death. All of these things can subject a healthcare professional to criminal liability. It's just a reality. So some common sources of criminal liability: patients or family members, they can file criminal complaints. Obviously, the DEA can investigate behavior or conduct that they deem to be criminal in nature related to narcotics and controlled substances. The Medicare and Medicaid fraud control units, they can conduct investigations that can result in criminal liability. Your employer, they can conduct an investigation and work with either the state, depending on what the allegation is, or the local police department, and also ask them to conduct an investigation by filing a criminal complaint or a police report. Local prosecutors, district attorneys, that's what I'm referring to there when I say local prosecutors. They can become aware of care that you provided that caused a patient death and decide to investigate it to determine if that care was so egregious that it rises to the level of committing a crime. They can also become aware of these things through the news, through reports. As I said before, patients or family members can file police reports. Your hospital can file a police report against you. So these are all typical sources of how care that you provide ends up with a criminal investigation. So here are my key takeaways. Criminal liability is highly unusual. The care that you provide, even if it unfortunately and tragically results in a death of a patient, does not typically result in a criminal investigation. Those matters are typically handled in civil court with medical malpractice cases, at the Board of Nursing with license complaints. They're not typically investigated by a criminal investigator, a local prosecutor, a district attorney, a state agency. It's very highly unusual that that happens. However, it does happen. And it usually happens when there is egregious behavior, gross negligence. I'll give you an example, and this is not an example from anything in the media. This is something that I'm just making up in my head. Say, for example, you were in the operating room and you were assisting a doctor with a surgery. Say, for example, you were drunk, you were impaired, and your impairment affected your ability to care for the patient and resulted in the patient suffering a death. That's egregious behavior. That is something that is typically investigated on a criminal level. Even though there may be a malpractice case and a license complaint, there may also, in that situation, most likely be also a criminal investigation, because that's egregious behavior, and that can be considered gross negligence. Documentation. Documentation is always key, even when it comes to making medical mistakes. You want to make sure that your documentation is consistent with the hospital's policy. The steps that you take after an incident or a medical mistake are critical. One of my favorite sayings, it's not what you do, it's how you handle what you do. That applies to a lot of things in life. And it's words that I live by, because we all make mistakes, we all fall short. But how do you handle it once you know that a mistake has been made? In the context of nursing and medical mistakes, you have to handle it appropriately. I am aware that because of recent news reports with nurses being indicted, convicted, sentenced, that nurses may fear filing an incident report, reporting a medical mistake, because they think that they will be criminally charged. And I really understand and I get that concern. But you really need to handle any mistake that you make in a very professional way that's consistent with your hospital's policy, protective of yourself, but also consistent with your hospital's policy, and above all, in a way that assists with correcting that mistake in a way so the patient survives and doesn't suffer further injury. Example, if you give a medication to a patient that the patient was allergic to, and you gave the medication, you're in the room talking to the patient, and all of a sudden the patient starts breaking out in hives and saying they're having trouble breathing. And then you're like, oh my God, this seems like an allergic reaction. And you put two and two together and you realize, I gave the wrong medication, or I gave the patient something that they were allergic to and I wasn't supposed to do that. The wrong thing to do would be to act like you don't know what happened. You call a rapid response, everybody's trying to figure out what happened, and you act like you don't know because you want to cover yourself. And then the patient passes away or suffers more injury. If you are criminally prosecuted for that mistake, those steps will be taken into consideration in the criminal case. The right thing to do would be everything you need to do to stabilize that patient, which includes letting the medical team know that's responsible for the care of that patient what you gave the patient, so they can give the patient medications to perhaps turn that situation around and address that allergic reaction. EpiPens, Benadryls, all types of things that addresses allergies, or even more things that the doctor may want to give, steroids. But if you act like you don't know what happened, that just delays the care that the patient could be receiving to address the emergency that's taken place. You think you're protecting yourself, but what you're actually doing is allowing someone to suffer and possibly die.